Now it's time to welcome Caroline Heldman. She's professor of political science at Occidental College. And Dr. Heldman, President Trump himself said on Fox yesterday, "I am not a king." This is the second well-attended coast-to-coast protest. What if, first of all, thank you for joining us on your Saturday. I'm sure you had other things to do today, so we appreciate your time. What's your assessment of how the previous marches have affected anything, and if the organizers expect this protest to have any kind of influence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the organizers have been really forthright in what they want to accomplish here, right? Which is to keep pressure on the Trump administration. These protests are being motivated by the unpopular policies of Donald Trump, right? He's underwater overall, but his policies are even more unpopular than he is now, just 6 months into his presidency, whether it's, the majority of people who stand against the ICE raids and how ICE is conducting itself, to the 72% of Americans who think tariffs will harm the economy, to the 95% of Americans who believe that birthright citizenship should not be overturned. Trump is in a position where, again, 6 months into his presidency, wildly unpopular. And when people don't have political power, they often will take to the streets or engage in boycotts or extra political activity in order to have their voices heard. And that's a really long way of saying that's what's happening today. This is the second big protest, probably going to be the biggest protest in U.S. history. We'll wait to see on that. But it's very clear that they're trying to send a message to the Trump administration about his wildly unpopular, some of them, policies.
I would just suggest that the previous protest, and who knows what the outcome of this one is going to be, that it meets with a mute reception from the White House. I mean, is that your assessment?
Well, this is certainly getting under their skin, I would say, in the White House more than the first protest. And you're pointing out the one in June. 5 million people turned out, and that was the largest protest in U.S. history. Just for a little context, 2017 had about 3.5 million people showing up for the Women's March to protest Trump's first inauguration. This, again, slated to be even bigger than either of those. The White House and other political Republican leaders have been talking about this as, a hate America protest and that sort of thing. So they're talking about it more than the first protest, which does, the fact maybe that it's sustained engagement and not a one-off is something that they might be seeing as a potential threat to their messaging.
Dr. Heldman, going in lockstep with protests in general against Trump administration policies is also the Prop 50. The proposition that California is trying to counter what they did in Texas to add 5 seats by gerrymandering districts in our state. And the folks out today who were pushing yes on 50 as part of this protest. What is your take on that? Opponents would say it's the two wrongs make a right, that they're so against what they're doing in Texas that we might as well do it here.
Well, and that's certainly a critique I'm hearing from some of my Democratic friends. Other Democratic friends are saying this is what is necessary in order to protect against the anti-democratic measures that are happening in Texas and some other states in order to maintain, I would argue, an anti-democratic control of Congress. I wish every single state had the Citizen Commission that Arnold Schwarzenegger put in almost a decade ago. Our democracy would just be so much stronger. I have a lot of Republican friends are saying, look, this is hypocrisy. You worked hard, right, in the state of California, as Democrat-led, to make sure that we had this Citizen Commission. Again, I said Democratic-led, but it really spearheaded by Arnold Schwarzenegger, but passed by Democrats. And yeah, there's something to that, right? So the question is, do we sacrifice in the state of California stronger democracy for a short-term political gain nationally? And it's very clear that Governor Newsom really wants to play out on the national stage with this.
Well, you're saying stronger democracy, but in fact, Republicans are already disproportionately not represented in California when you look at sheer numbers. And so this is going to further disenfranchise folks in conservative communities. So again, this is the critics' argument that folks who are often talking about threats to democracy in the United States are now threatening it in California.
Oh, 100%. There's the hypocrisy, right? And as I was saying, I would love every state to have a citizen commission that is bipartisan so that gerrymandering and the drawing of districts that happens every 10 years based on the census is not done in a partisan fashion. So this is a short-term loss of democracy in California for what is being argued is a longer term gain for democracy for our country. But you're right. I mean, Californians, it will further disenfranchise conservatives in California, just as liberals and Democrats are being disenfranchised in other states that have heavily gerrymandered their districts. So it's, yeah, two wrongs. Do they make a right? I guess the question, we also have a Supreme Court case right now, and you didn't ask about this, so I'm sort of going down a rabbit hole, but it is possible that the Democrats will pretty much be locked out of the legislative branch at the national level if that case goes through and that the gerrymandering is allowed to happen in a partisan fashion without concern about race across the United States. So really big questions about democracy, and of course, Prop 50 being the one that is facing us right now in California.
We're looking live right now at Market Street, and the tens of thousands of people who have gathered to march from Sue Bierman Park by the Ferry Building all the way up to Civic Center Plaza in a day of protest. I'm not quite sure how much longer I have with you, but I'll take you as long as you've got. What is your assessment, by the way? You'd mentioned the Supreme Court. What's your assessment in terms of how they have been performing as opposed to expectation? Have they surprised you with some of their less conservative decisions? Or do you think they're just doing what a conservative court would do?
They are doing something we've never seen in the U.S. context. As a scholar of the courts, looking at it for 250 years, they have essentially disregarded a lot of major precedents in order to reshape the country and the government in a more conservative image. And what this means is, for example, like I do expect that the final kind of nail in the coffin of the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965 will be hammered in by this court, and they are extending a tradition of overturning some of the principles that we hold very dearly. Some people, of course, assuming that reproductive rights were a core part of the Constitution, and that being overturned without regard for precedents. We do see a lot of precedents getting overturned. And I will say, as somebody who teaches this, we used to say that the courts would expand a precedence or they would narrow a precedence. We now have to say, well, for the first time in U.S. history, they're actually reversing or completely disregarding precedents in a very public way. So, and I'll just add, the court is doing what Donald Trump is doing in many regards, of going against public opinion for a lot of these decisions. So the court is wildly out of step with public opinion on major decisions, for example, reproductive rights. Let's see whether or not, they are called to check if there's a shift in terms of power at the federal level, the legislative level. I do expect the Democrats to take the House in the next midterm elections. Let's see if that has any sort of brakes or effect on the court being so out of step with public opinion.
Understood. And so far, with what you've seen in the protests that began in New York and now are on the West Coast, any observations about the protests? To me, they seem fairly peaceful, emphatic, and vocal.
Yeah, it's what I would expect from, millions of housewives and electricians and middle Americans coming out to protest. What I do think is remarkable, though, about this particular protest and the one in June is not only the size, but the fact that it's happening in urban and rural areas is very interesting to me. It does mean that Indivisible and the organizers are able to mobilize people in all walks of life throughout the United States. And I bring this up because as these protests are being painted as being anti-American or Antifa protests, I mean, I'm sure Antifa is an ideology. I'm sure there's a lot of anti-fascists in these groups, but they're not violent because they're just like run-of-the-mill, probably mainstream, mostly mainstream Democrats getting out to the streets and protesting when they feel that they are otherwise locked out of having a voice in government.
Caroline Heldman, political science professor out of Occidental College. Caroline, I really appreciate it. We'll let you get back to your regularly scheduled Saturday. Thanks very much.